The Rigel Black Chronicles, Book 1, The Pureblood Pretense. Chapter 8. After their afternoon herbology lesson, Rigel let Draco and Pansy walk ahead of her up the lawn, while she veered toward the lake, where Fred and George had promised to introduce her to their clever and conveniently fifth-year older brother. A line of leafy trees presided over the shore of the lake, and a number of older students had taken refuge under their branches. She wondered at what level they would earn free periods, and doubted she'd spend that extra time chatting under trees, unless she had already read all the potions books in the library by then. She walked the length of the shoreline, but didn't see any redheads she recognized. Just as she was debating returning to the castle, an unfamiliar voice called her into the shade. "Rigel Black, yeah?" The speaker was a smiling boy with dreadlocks that brushed his shoulders when he stuck out his hand. "Lee Jordan, Fred and George mentioned you'd be coming down." White teeth flashed brightly against his mahogany skin, and the mischief in his brown eyes seemed barely contained by their thick, spiky lashes. "They mentioned you too. Pleased to meet you." Jordan grinned. "You say that like you mean it." "I do mean it." Rigel allowed polite confusion to bleed into her tone. "A Slytherin never means anything." He waved his hand. "But neither does a prankster, so you're actually in excellent company." "Gryffindor seems to have cornered the field in that regard," she said wryly. Jordan inclined his head magnanimously. "My year in particular, but aside from me, Fred, and George, you're unlikely to meet additional competition." "Competition?" Rigel smiled with her eyes. "Somehow I doubt I'm in the running." "Son of a marauder, and you don't have an aptitude for pranks." "That's not what the twins—" Jordan broke off, turning toward the commotion coming their way. No, you two are not throwing me in the lake." Fred and George were literally dragging their older brother down the path toward them. Percy had a look of panic and was struggling vainly. She wondered if they'd taken his wand, or if Percy was above doing magic on his little brothers. "I mean it this time. I'll owl Mum if you don't release me this instant." Fred and George dropped Percy's arms as though they had caught fire. Fred chuckled nervously. "Let's not drag poor old Mum into this. I'm telling her you called her old and poor." "Now, Perk, there's no need for all that." George cut across his brother quickly, pointing toward their shady tree. "We've just brought you here to meet someone, see?" "Who?" Percy demanded, looking around. "I've already met Lee." "It's the little one behind Lee." Fred jogged forward and dragged Rigel into clearer view. "This one here." "Oh." Percy adjusted his horn-rimmed glasses and smoothed his robes before stepping forward to meet her. "I'm Percy Weasley. My brothers didn't drag you down here too, did they? Because manhandling a first year is an entirely unacceptable sort of—" "Drag? What drag?" Fred reared his head back in exaggerated effrontery. "Actually, I asked them to introduce us," she said. "I'm Rigel Black. You helped me out on the train ride, if you remember. So when I discovered who you were, I wanted to thank you formally." "Ah." Percy seemed extremely taken aback, as though no one had ever thanked him for anything in his life. "Well, there's no need for all that, but you're welcome. I'm glad I was there. Flint isn't usually that troublesome, but he tends to be in a terrible mood on the train, and sometimes he takes it out on others. We're in the same house now, so we've worked out our differences, but I still wanted to thank you for stepping in when you did." Rigel widened her eyes and tilted her head back earnestly. "It was above and beyond, and I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Percy flushed. "Just doing my duty as a prefect. Still, I'll try and pay back the favor someday, if you're ever in trouble." From the looks the twins exchanged behind Percy's back, she needed to dial it back a little, so Rigel softened her expression from outright adoration to something more admiring. The tallest redhead acknowledged her words a tad uncomfortably. "And if you should need help again, I'll be glad to do what I can, of course." Rigel widened her eyes guilelessly. "Would you?" she asked wonderingly. It was just the opening she'd been waiting for. "I wouldn't want to be a bother, and I'd ask a Ravenclaw, but I don't know any, and you seem so smart." "Yes?" Percy prompted, his chest inflated ever so slightly. "What is it?" Well, I'm curious about so many things, but sometimes I don't understand it the way the book explains. Could I come ask you when I get confused in my studies?" She infused her voice with tentative hope. "Of course," Percy assured her. "Far be it from me to keep an eager young mind from knowledge. Any time you want to discuss something academic, just come up and knock on the Gryffindor common room. Fred and George can show you where, and even if I'm not there, someone will be able to find me." "Thanks so much." Rigel aimed her best smile up at the prefect. "Yes, well," Percy adjusted his glasses and nodded curtly to her. "Just maybe don't wear that tie and it should be fine." With that, he said goodbye to Lee and his brothers and started back up the path toward the castle. "Well, I'm impressed," said Jordan when Percy had gone. "It took Fred and George 3 months to get an invite to the Slytherin common room. Though they never did let us come back after that first time," Fred said wistfully. "Some people just can't hold their jinxed sweets." George gave Rigel an odd look. "We would have let you in the common room. Supervised, of course. If you'd asked, you know." "I really do want to talk to your brother," Rigel said. "I think he'll be a wonderful resource for my studies." "Whatever you say," Fred said slowly. "Only careful who you use that look on in the future. You can only get away with it so long, even at your age." They were observant. She would take the advice under consideration. "And don't forget to stop in and see us when you come up to the nest," George added. "We gotta go." Jordan had a temper spell floating above his wrist. "Oliver called a team meeting about the trials next week, remember? And McGonagall wants to talk to me about commentating." "Nice meeting you, Jordan," Rigel said. "One day I'll believe you, kid." He laughed as the 3 of them ran off. But not today. Dinner was spent twisting her vegetables across her plate and avoiding Draco's increasingly exasperated questions about where she went after herbology. She didn't know how to explain why she needed an upperclassman to ask about advanced studies when, as they were correctly aware, she wasn't interested in any studies that didn't include potions. It was Pansy who finally shut him up. "That's enough, Draco," she said severely. "Rigel doesn't have to tell you everything he does. He can disappear if he wants to, and I would say the same if someone was pressuring you to say where you'd been this afternoon." Draco set his face mulishly, but subsided for the moment. He started to wind up again when Rigel told them she had somewhere to be after dinner, but a look from Pansy made him shrug as nonchalantly as an 11-year-old could manage and go with the others back to the Slytherin common room without another word. Rigel approached Snape's office in the dungeons with slow, deliberate steps. She'd waited exactly 5 minutes after he left the staff table before following. She wanted to seem punctual, but not impatient. The door to Snape's office was made of sturdy oak, but it felt like an insurmountable barrier stood between her and the other side. What if he hated my essay? What if the things I wrote down were too obvious? She lifted a hand to knock on the door, but dropped it again when she noticed it shaking. She had thought that assignment seemed too easy. There was probably a trick somewhere she'd missed, and now he was going to think she was the most oblivious student who ever had the nerve to waste their professor's time. "Don't chicken out," she told herself firmly. This was what she had come to do. She knocked firmly before she could stop herself. "Enter." The call was sharp, but he didn't sound angry. Disproportionately relieved that he hadn't told her to go away instead, she turned the silver handle, distracted for a moment by the shine of the curious metal. Odd choice for a dungeon doorknob. Professor Snape's office was a sparse, square room decorated with the most gruesome of ingredients. Jars of spleens, eyeballs, dried wings, and scales were displayed like trophies on the many shelves. Otherwise, there were no personal touches, no books or keepsakes, no art save a portrait of Salazar Slytherin. The only furniture was a basic wooden desk and the chair Snape sat on. The desk was empty, but for a stack of detention slips and trays that looked like they would hold essays later in the year. His chair looked uncomfortable, and she couldn't picture him sitting there working for several hours a day. She wondered whether the office was merely for show. If so, it was a good intimidation tactic. She certainly felt intimidated as she moved to stand in front of his desk, hands folded behind her back. He looked at her consideringly from the other side of it, and she tried to keep her returning stare deferential. But it was difficult. She did not like to be intimidated. If he'd called her there to ridicule her for something she'd missed in her essay, she would not hesitate to defend herself, no matter how much she respected him. He took in her stance and expression, and the lines on his face softened for a brief instant. It was the kind of unintended slack created when a person was caught off guard by a memory they thought they'd forgotten. It passed quickly, however, and Snape pressed his mouth into an even thinner line than it usually presented. "Mr. Black," he began, his tone once again one of carefully correct neutrality, "I find it difficult to imagine that you completed the essay I assigned in the extra time at the end of today's lesson." She opened her mouth, but he held up a hand and continued. "I'm not accusing you of anything, but it is possible that a student would be able to get the essay topic from a Ravenclaw or Hufflepuff who had their practical lesson yesterday and complete the essay ahead of time in a misguided endeavor to get into my good books, as they say." Rigel's eyes widened in unfabricated dismay. He thought her a dishonest brown-noser. She might be trying to impress him, but she would not go so far as to feign her work. "Is there any way I can convince you of my sincerity?" She could not fully keep the trepidation from her voice. "There is." Snape folded his hands on the desk and held her gaze. "If you are to convince me you do not require references when writing such an essay, I would ask you to write another now, in my presence." She blew out a breath she didn't know she was holding. Was that all? She'd already asked for another assignment, so that sounded more like he was capitulating than testing her. Snape misinterpreted her exhale, and his eyes sharpened. "Know that I do not mean to attack you, Mr. Black. The essay you gave me conveyed an advanced understanding of the basics of brewing. This second assignment would be a way for me to accurately gauge your capability. But if you choose to, you may leave here without writing the assignment, and we shall not speak of this again. Our dealings will remain the same as any of your Slytherin classmates." Bully, that. She lifted her chin, confident she could tackle almost any potions-related essay he gave her. Even if she didn't know, she could make a reasonable guess. "I didn't bring a quill or parchment." He reached into a desk drawer and pulled out a clean roll of parchment, along with a set of writing instruments. He set them on the desk, silently, almost daring her to take them. "What is the essay, sir?" she asked, her confidence dipping once more. What if it was something terribly advanced, like the recipe for wolfsbane or Felix Felicis? "It is not an essay, per se." He lifted an eyebrow, and now she could see it was definitely a challenge. Simply list every potion's ingredient you know of, followed by any dangers and uses you remember. It is meant to be along the same lines as what we covered in class yesterday, though if you know of others not discussed in class, please add those as well. Take your time. There is no length requirement, but I would like to understand the breadth of your knowledge. Rigel nodded and reached to take the writing supplies. "May I use the other side of your desk to write on, sir?" "I have not often been called fair," he said dryly, "but I have never yet forced a student to write an essay standing up." So saying, he pulled out his wand and conjured a student desk and chair in the corner of the room for her use. She thanked him, then sat and immediately began writing. "Abera leaves, used in skelligro, sliced, and nutrient potion, diced. Must be harvested by pulling the roots of the plant up intact, or else the leaves dry out and become poisonous within 3 days. Aconite, used in wolfsbane, the flowers crushed, various poisons, usually the stalks, shredded, and recently in ardor, increasing potions, just the pollinated stamens, though this method is largely untested. Very dangerous to collect, as it grows most prolifically in werewolf territory and must be harvested with silver at the full moon. Also poisonous to ingest and difficult to add to potions without causing them to explode. Highly reactive to most other ingredients. Adder stingers, used mainly in prank potions to cause embarrassing rashes or other skin conditions, with the exception of its use in morning sickness remedies for pregnant witches in their first trimester. Dangerous because too much in any potion can make it too hot to drink without burning the throat of the drinker severely. should wear gloves when working with it. Aesop's flower, used by those in the field of divination for dream-walking potions. Strong hallucinogen, sometimes sold on the black market as a recreational drug. Dangerously addictive in frequent heavy doses. And so it went. Rigel wrote all the way to melanite, used for muscle cramp relief potions, ground and dried, as well as in intestinal regulation potions and in many balms and pastes for sore or stiff muscles. Dangerous only if a person inhales the fumes of it in a potion, loses muscle control and causes an accident. Then she ran out of parchment. She rose and walked the few steps over to Snape's desk. He seemed to be drafting a letter, so she kept her eyes politely away from his parchment and waited for him to come to a stopping point. He set down his quill and reached out a hand toward her, palm up. "Finished?" he asked. "No, sir," Rigel said. Snape looked up, then around the room, seeming surprised by how low the torches had burned. "I need more parchment." "More parchment?" he repeated, frowning. "Yes," she said, apologetic. Perhaps he was irritated she had used so much. "I'll be sure to reimburse you for the supplies." "Rhyme!" he scowled blackly. "Give me that!" He summoned the roll of parchment from her desk and unrolled it, staring at the small, even writing on the front, then slowly turning it over to the backside, which was equally saturated. "I only got halfway through the M's," she said regretfully. His eyes snapped up to hers. "Sit, now!" He crooked his finger at the chair she was using, which slid over to face his desk with a jarring scrape of wood on stone. When she hesitated, startled by his sudden impatience when he had seemed pleased to wait around all night before, he gestured imperiously for her to use it. She sat quietly while his eyes moved rapidly across, then down, the scroll. She mentally compiled the rest of the ingredients she remembered in case he asked her to recite them orally instead. Minutes passed in silence, their only interruption when Snape flipped the roll over. At last he flung down the parchment and fixed her with an iron stare. "Do you have a photographic memory, Mr. Black?" "No, sir." "An extreme fascination for herbology," he suggested. She thought he sounded sick. "Not particularly," she said quietly. "Am I to understand, then, that you have more than a passing interest in potions, Mr. Black?" Snape clenched his teeth on her surname convulsively. "Exactly, sir." She searched his face, eyes flicking desperately over too pale skin and flame-retardant gel slicked into chemically damaged hair. "As long as I can remember, it's all I've really cared about. You understand, don't you? No one else does. They say I know enough about potions, and I should concentrate on something else, but I can't. Nothing else interests me. But you'll teach me new things, won't you? I don't mean to impose, and I'm sure you get a lot of requests for tutelage, considering your position in the potions community. It's just I'm so tired of learning from books." His eyes closed like steel curtains for a long moment. Rigel tried to focus on the jars of ingredients, the situation with Flint, her new and strange friendship with Draco, anything but Snape and his unreadable expression. Perhaps it was just the tension in the room, but it seemed to Rigel her fate hung in the balance in that moment. Whatever came next, it was entirely up to him. Snape sighed heavily. "The level of knowledge you have displayed today is nothing short of incredible for a first-year student, so perhaps you will forgive me for having been somewhat reluctant to believe it." He passed his hand across his eyes. His nostrils flared as he added, "I do understand." Rigel hadn't realized what those words would mean, placed together like that and coming from Snape, until he said them. She'd heard of losing a weight you didn't know you carried, but this felt like a window had opened, and she hadn't even known she was indoors, as though she'd been looking at a world removed by glass without realizing it, and now she could feel the breeze. She closed her eyes to savor those words, then opened them and poured everything she felt for potions into her gaze. It was more difficult than she expected, perhaps because she had never fully shared this part of herself with anyone, but she projected all her passion and curiosity and longing, the despair when she realized her dream was here at Hogwarts, where she could never be, and the triumph of those words, of having her dream validated at last. She shoved it all toward Master Snape, wanting him to see, to know as she knew that potions was the only thing she could ever do. One moment she was offering up her soul, equal parts willing Snape to understand and wondering desperately if he thought she had what it took, and the next, her consciousness slipped, shifted, and the feelings were not hers. Disbelief and ambivalent consternation, and the thoughts were not either. What was she to do? Be glad to have found a Slytherin at last who had the potential she needed, or bitterly resent that it would be Black to have such a son, one wasted on him if the boy had to learn potions from a book, and then she was gasping for air, feeling only her own bewilderment and nausea. She staggered back from the desk, her breath short and somewhat panicked. Snape was frozen, eyes flared in surprised anger. "What just happened?" Rigel asked, putting a hand to her temple. "So, I would ask you, if I did not already know what happened. You projected your unsolicited thoughts to me, and what's more, you trespassed on my thoughts regarding you in a flagrant violation of—" Rigel cut across him. "You saw my thoughts? What did you see?" Her voice rose uncontrollably toward her natural octave. "I don't understand how—" Her voice failed her, and she buried her face in her hands, trembling violently. He was furious. She was exposed. What had she done? It couldn't all end there. It just couldn't. "Precisely what I wish to know," Snape growled. "How did you do this?" "My mind is shielded, and that was no legilimency I've ever experienced. It was as though I were originator of the feelings you projected, instead of merely an observer to your experiences. What did you do, Mr. Black?" She heard him speaking, but it was from such a long way away it didn't register that he was talking to her. It came louder. "Mr. Black, Arctur, Rigel. Huh, what, me?" Rigel gulped the air desperately. "Of course, boy, who else?" Snape began again. "Rigel, you are having a panic attack. Take slower breaths and talk through it." He inhaled deeply and let it out slowly. She found herself mimicking him without realizing it until her trembling ceased. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Professor." She sucked in air and babbled as coherently as she could. "I didn't mean to. I wasn't trying to—" The air was just out of reach. She closed her eyes to focus on getting the words out. It was important, he understood her. "I just wanted to make you understand that I'm serious about being here. Please don't send me home. I swear I didn't know what I was—" "I am not going to expel you, Rigel," Snape said slowly and clearly. "If you cannot control your fear, I will provide you a calming draught." "Oh, no, thank you." She was not expelled. She was not expelled, and he was not as angry as he'd first appeared. Her heart rate calmed even further as she realized he still referred to her as Rigel Black. If his side of that strange experience had been as disorientating as hers, it was unlikely he'd noticed anything significantly incriminating. So what now, sir? I don't understand what happened here, but it is clear you did not intend it, and it has cleared any doubts I may have had about your sincerity in learning my art," Professor Snape said carefully. "Provided it does not happen again, I see no reason for the last 10 minutes to affect anything beyond this room." Her head shot up so fast it cricked, and she stared, unable to believe it could go away so easily. "Truly, you would give me another chance?" Snape set his face determinately. "You have not yet spent your first chance, Mr. Black." She caught the unconscious emphasis on her last name again. "My father—" "Your father does not factor here." Her mouth fell open, just like that. He was going to ignore the fact that he and Sirius hated one another. "Then you think I have talent, enough to pursue this field? You might have tremendous talent, but that is not the reason I will take you as my student. More than talent, you have drive, and that is the hallmark of our house. Do you understand?" He caught her gaze, and she found she did not understand. Not really. There was a fierce promise in his expression. "I will cheer for Gryffindor before I see that ambition atrophy." Draco had said, but she hadn't believed it. He would teach her merely because she wanted it badly enough. Then she had never needed to prove her knowledge or ability at all. Rigel swayed a bit on her feet, suddenly exhausted. "It's been a long day for us both, Mr. Black." Snape's voice held a thread of amusement she didn't think she had imagined, and she wondered if perfect neutrality had drifted ever so slightly towards lukewarm. "Get some sleep, and we will deal with the aftermath of this when we must. For Monday, you may choose one ingredient from the list you compiled and write 10 inches of in-depth discussion on it." "Yes, sir." Rigel moved toward the door, but paused. "Thank you." He nodded curtly, and something about the cool professionalism pushed her to add, "You won't regret this, Professor Snape, I promise you." "Of that I have no doubts, Mr. Black." We hope you enjoyed this chapter. Please consider supporting our project by joining our Patreon linked in the description, or become a member here on YouTube, where you will get access to several additional chapters weeks before they release on YouTube.